So I'm going to be reading and commenting on passages from the chapter on the importance of structure from Jerome Bruner's book, The Process of Education. This is chapter 2, from chapter 2, The Importance of Structure. The first object of any act of learning, over and beyond the pleasure it may give, is that it should serve us in the future. Learning should not only take us somewhere, it should allow us later to go further more easily. This is one of those packed sentences. I'll read it again. The first object of any act of learning, over and beyond the pleasure it may give, is that it should serve us in the future. Learning should not only take us somewhere, it should allow us later to go further more easily. And this gets into a lot of what Jerome Bruner means by structure and curriculum, the importance of structure, that what you learn needs to serve you later. You shouldn't have to unlearn what you've learned. There are two ways in which learning serves the future. One is through its specific applicability to tasks that are highly similar to those we originally learned to perform. Psychologists refer to this phenomenon as specific transfer of training. Perhaps it should be called the extension of habits or associations. Its utility appears to be limited in the main to what we usually speak of as skills. Having learned how to hammer nails, we are better able later to learn how to hammer tacks or chip wood. Learning in school undoubtedly creates skills of a kind that transfers to activities encountered later, either in school or after. He's not really talking about structure here. He's presenting a foil for what structure is. A second way in which earlier learning renders later performance, now he's getting into structure. A second way in which earlier learning renders later performance more efficient is through what is conveniently called non-specific transfer, or more accurately, the transfer of principles and attitudes. In essence, it consists of learning initially not a skill, but a general idea, which can then be used as a basis for recognizing subsequent problems as special cases of the idea originally mastered. This type of transfer is at the heart of the educational process, the continual broadening and deepening of knowledge in terms of basic and general ideas. So this is maybe his best articulation of the importance of structure. So this type of transfer is at the heart of the educational process, the continual broadening and deepening of knowledge in terms of basic and general ideas. So what you learn early on are going to be basic general ideas, and then as your education continues, you're broadening and deepening that knowledge. Hopefully not correcting in the sense of having to throw out and start anew, but deepening and broadening something that you learned as a basic idea, but now you're getting a better, deeper sense for it. The continuity of learning that is produced by the second type of transfer of principles, is dependent upon mastery of the structure of the subject matter, as structure was described in the preceding chapter. That is to say, in order for a person to be able to recognize the applicability or inapplicability of an idea to a new situation, and to broaden his learning thereby, he must have clearly in mind the general nature of the phenomenon with which he is dealing. The more fundamental or basic is the idea he has learned, almost by definition, the greater will be its breadth of applicability to new problems. Indeed, this is almost a tautology, for what is meant by fundamental in this sense is precisely that an idea has wide as well as powerful applicability. It is simple enough to proclaim, of course, that school curricula and methods of teaching should be geared to the teaching of fundamental ideas in whatever subject is being taught. But as soon as one makes such a statement, a host of problems arise, many of which can be solved only with the aid of considerably more research. We turn to some of these now. The first and most obvious problem is how to construct curricula that can be taught by ordinary teachers to ordinary students, and that at the same time reflect clearly the basic or underlying principles of various fields of inquiry. The problem is twofold. So let me read that again. The first most obvious problem is how to construct curricula that can be taught by ordinary teachers to ordinary students, and that at the same time reflect clearly the basic or underlying principles of various fields of inquiry that the students will later be able to broaden and deepen and amplify instead of correcting and having to throw out. The problem is twofold. First, how to have the basic subjects rewritten and their teaching materials revamped in such a way that the pervading and powerful ideas and attitudes relating to them are given a central role. Second, how to match the levels of these materials to the capacities of students of different abilities at different grades in school. The experience of the past several years has taught at least one important lesson about the design of a curriculum that is true to the underlying structure of its subject matter. It is that the best minds in any particular discipline must be put to work on the task. And this gets to his concern that we can't have professors and graduate students secluded and only talking amongst themselves about the frontiers of the field. The decision as to what should be taught in American history to elementary school children, or what should be taught in arithmetic, is a decision that can best be reached with the aid of those with a high degree of vision and competence in each of these fields. To decide that the elementary ideas of algebra depend upon the fundamentals of the commutative, distributive, and associative laws, one must be a mathematician in a position to appreciate and understand the fundamentals of mathematics. Whether school children require an understanding of Frederick Jackson Turner's ideas about the role of the frontier in American history before they can sort out the facts and trends of American history, this again is a decision that requires the help of the scholar who has a deep understanding of the American past. Only by the use of our best minds in devising curricula will we bring the fruits of scholarship and wisdom to the student just beginning his studies. We have a good sense for why we need the best minds, the people who are the most familiar with the field, to help us understand what are the big ideas, the big structures that when we learn them, they're going to carry us the furthest. And that is what structure is in curriculum, and that's why it's so important. There is at least one major matter that is left unsettled even by a large-scale revision of curricula in the direction indicated. Mastery of the fundamental ideas of a field involves not only the grasping of general principles, but also the development of an attitude toward learning and inquiry, toward guessing and hunches, toward the possibility of solving problems on one's own. Inherent in the preceding discussions are at least 4 general claims that can be made for teaching the fundamental structure of a subject, claims in need of detailed study. So now he's saying, okay, we've talked about structure, now here are 4 general claims we've come to. The first is that understanding fundamentals makes a subject more comprehensible. This is true not only in physics and mathematics, where we have principally illustrated the point, but equally in the social studies and literature. Once one has grasped the fundamental idea that a nation must trade in order to live, then such a presumably special phenomenon as the triangular trade of the American colonies becomes altogether simpler to understand, as something more than commerce in molasses, sugar, cane, rum, and slaves in an atmosphere of violation of British trade regulations. The high school student reading Moby Dick can only understand more deeply if he can be led to understand that Melville's novel is, among other things, a study of the theme of evil and the plight of those pursuing this killing whale. And if the student is led further to understand that there are a relatively limited number of human plights about which novels are written, he understands literature the better for it. So, understanding fundamentals makes a subject more comprehensible. And we could almost define the role of structure or define what is fundamental about a discipline in this way. Understanding fundamentals makes a subject more comprehensible. So what are the fundamental ideas that will make a subject more comprehensible later? Again, how can we leverage, what are the most powerful ideas that we can leverage the furthest, that will carry us the furthest in a discipline? And again, Bruner is going to say, well, we need the people who have the best sense for the discipline to help us understand what those levers would be, what those ideas would be. The second point relates to human memory. Perhaps the most basic thing that can be said about human memory after a century of intensive research is that unless detail is placed into a structured pattern, it is rapidly forgotten. Detailed material is conserved in memory by the use of simplified ways of representing it. These simplified representations have what may be called a regenerative character. A good example of this regenerative property of long-term memory can be found in science. Now he'll give some examples. A scientist does not try to remember the distances traversed by falling bodies in different gravitational fields over different periods of time. What he carries in memory instead is a formula that permits him, with varying degrees of accuracy, to regenerate the details on which the more easily remembered formula is based. So he commits to memory the formula S equals 1/2 gt squared, and not a handbook of distances, times, and gravitational constants. He's not going to have a list that he's jotted down that he has to memorize or has to refer to. Instead, it's just, you have this simple rule, and this is part of structure. That simple rule can carry you further. Similarly, one does not remember exactly what Marlowe, the commentator in Lord Jim, said about the chief protagonist's plight, but rather simply that he was the dispassionate onlooker, the man who tried to understand without judging what had led Lord Jim into the straits in which he found himself. We remember a formula, a vivid detail that carries the meaning of an event, an average that stands for a range of events, a caricature or picture that preserves an essence, all of them techniques of condensation and representation. What learning general, so all these ways that you kind of condense, crystallize, distill what you've learned, or represent a shortcut to your knowledge. So all of these, what learning general, now he's bringing it back to structure. What learning general or fundamental principle does is to ensure that memory loss will not mean total loss, that what remains will permit us to reconstruct the details when needed. A good theory is the vehicle not only for understanding a phenomenon now, but also for remembering it or being able to recreate it tomorrow. Third, an understanding of fundamental principles and ideas, as noted earlier, appears to be the main road to adequate transfer of training. To understand something as a specific instance of a more general case, which is what understanding a more fundamental principle or structure means, is to have learned not only a specific thing, but also a model for understanding other things like it that one may encounter. A carefully wrought understanding should also permit him to recognize the limits of the generalization as well. The idea of principles and concepts as a basis for transfer is hardly new. It is much in need of more research of a specific kind that would provide detailed knowledge of how best to proceed in the teaching of different subjects in different grades. The fourth claim for emphasis on structure and principles in teaching is that by constantly re-examining material taught in elementary and secondary schools for its fundamental character, one is able to narrow the gap between advanced knowledge and elementary knowledge. Part of the difficulty now in the progression from primary school through high school to college is that material learned earlier is either out of date or misleading by virtue of its lagging too far behind developments in a field. So this is, Bruner has articulated this idea that I've kind of beat around the bush about. When there's not a continuity from what is happening at the frontiers of a field and what students are learning in elementary and secondary and undergraduate levels, we have a lot of waste. And so now reading his passage again, part of the difficulty now found in the progression from primary school through high school to college is that material learned earlier is either out of date or misleading by virtue of its lagging too far behind developments in the field, because there isn't good communication between those at the frontiers and those at the earlier levels. This gap can be reduced by the kind of emphasis set forth in the preceding discussion. And now this is at the end of this chapter on the importance of structure. To recapitulate, the main theme of this chapter has been that the curriculum of a subject should be determined by the most fundamental understanding that can be achieved of the underlying principles that give structure to that subject. Teaching specific topics or skills without making it clear their context in the broader fundamental structure of a field of knowledge is uneconomical in several deep senses. In the first place, such teaching makes it exceedingly difficult for the student to generalize from what he has learned to what he will encounter later. So we've talked about several examples. Another example that comes to mind, it won't be a perfect example, but if you think about memorizing times tables, that if all a student did was memorize times tables, and then if they were ever introduced to if they were ever challenged to multiply two other numbers that weren't in those times tables, we don't want to be in a position where the student would be like, well, I don't know, that wasn't one of the times tables I memorized. So there's no way I have no idea how I got those. I just memorized those. They're not really meaningful. I just memorized that 3 times 2 is 6 and 6 times 2 is 12 and whatever other times tables you've memorized. But if you can't move beyond that, then we've missed out on an opportunity, and we've missed out on a better way to approach it that could have helped the students move on from that lesson. In the first place, such teaching makes it exceedingly difficult for the student to generalize from what he has learned to what he will encounter later. So that's a big key. Let me read that again. In the first place, such teaching where you're oblivious or neglectful of the structure, or teach misleading structure. In the first place, such teaching makes it exceedingly difficult for the student to generalize from what he has learned to what he will encounter later. In the second place, learning that has fallen short of a grasp of general principles has little reward in terms of intellectual excitement. The best way to create interest in a subject is to render it worth knowing, which means to make the knowledge gained usable in one's thinking beyond the situation in which the learning has occurred. So you can imagine the difference between a student who is told you just memorize these times tables to another student who is told, who understands what the times tables are referring to or how these numbers relate. And that student could multiply any number or any 2 numbers or any however many numbers versus the other student who would be like, no, I have my fixed list of numbers of times tables I've memorized, and it ends there. There's no kind of moving beyond that for that student. Third, knowledge one has acquired without sufficient structure to tie it together is knowledge that is likely to be forgotten. An unconnected set of facts has a pitiably short half-life in memory. Let me read that again. An unconnected set of facts has a pitiably short half-life in memory. Organizing facts in terms of principles and ideas from which they may be inferred is the only known way of reducing the quick rate of loss of human memory. Designing curricula in a way that reflects the basic structure of a field of knowledge requires the most fundamental understanding of that field. So there is some passages and commentary from Bruner's on the role of structure from Bruner's chapter, The Importance of Structure from the Process of Education.